Welcome back to Antisocial Studies. Last episode, we talked about the role of enslaved people in the Revolutionary era as a whole, but now I want to talk for a few minutes about arguably the most famous enslaved person of this era, Sally Hemings. And even though we're going to look at one exceptional case of an enslaved woman's experience in which she actually gained some informal power and agency, I need us to acknowledge the millions of women whose names aren't remembered and whose lives didn't end up like hers. She is the exception to the millions whose names and stories we don't know. Who was Sally Hemings? Her mother was enslaved and her father was her enslaver, who is believed to be Martha Jefferson's father. I want that to sink in for a second. She was half sisters with Martha Jefferson, Thomas's wife. Thomas Jefferson inherited her from his father-in-law soon after his wife Martha died. And growing up, Sally served as a household servant for Jefferson's daughter, who was also technically her own half-niece, Martha's daughter. When Sally was 14, she traveled to Paris with the Jefferson family to accompany their daughter. It's generally believed that Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson entered into a sexual relationship on this trip to Paris. From here on out, I'm going to call it their relationship, just because I don't have a succinct term for an inherently non-consensual relationship between a future president and his enslaved person that possibly had some emotional connection behind it, but there's no way to know because she wasn't allowed to tell her story because, oh yeah, she was a 14-year-old enslaved girl. So, for expediency, I'm just going to call it their relationship. But obviously, it's way more complicated than that. Apparently, after becoming pregnant for the first time, Hemings used this as leverage against Jefferson. She refused to return home to Virginia without guarantees from him that included extraordinary privileges for herself and the guaranteed freedom of any of her future children. Jefferson agreed that all of her children would be freed at the age of 21. How nice of him. And Sally returned home with the Jeffersons. Although their first child died soon after birth, Sally had at least 5 other children with Thomas Jefferson. 4 survived into adulthood, and it's through them that we know anything about this relationship. Now, Jefferson held up his end and freed all of their children when they entered adulthood, but Sally herself was never emancipated during Jefferson's lifetime. When he died, his daughter Martha unofficially freed her when she was probably in her late 50s. She lived for 10 more years with her 2 younger sons in Charlottesville, Virginia. One of them, Madison Hemings, would later go on to tell his and his mother's story. So what happened to their children? Well, Jefferson never recognized them as his own, obviously. I mean, the 2 youngest were born while he was the president of the United States. That would not have gone over well. But rumors of this relationship were already being circulated by his opponents before he was elected. The 2 older children, Beverly and Harriet Hemings, both were apparently light-skinned enough to pass into white society after being allowed to leave Monticello, and they did not ever speak of their connection to Jefferson or their African blood, which would have excluded them from general society. But the 2 younger surviving children that we know of eventually embraced their complicated heritage. They lived with their mother Sally in Charlottesville after she was allowed to leave Monticello, and then they both moved to Ohio after she passed away. Everyone wants to go to Ohio. Madison Hemings immersed himself in the Black community there. At the age of 68, he gave an interview to the local newspaper claiming that his father was the former president and telling his mother's story. The article garnered international attention, but scientific proof that confirmed his identity wouldn't exist for another 100 years. The youngest, Eston Hemings, became a well-known professional musician in Ohio. He eventually ended up in Wisconsin, where he changed his last name to Jefferson, as well as his racial identity. Essentially, when he moved, he stopped identifying as half-black, and he and his family entered white society. His descendants, including 2 sons who fought for the Union in the Civil War, all identified as white. For those of you who are wondering about how someone who's light-skinned enough could pass as white, let's just remind ourselves that race is a social construct. Race was invented by people. In fact, we know it was kind of invented by white people in the 1500s to start to define them as white and thus different from the people they were meeting and colonizing around the world. You can go watch a whole video about this that I did. So really, racism from the beginning has been an entirely subjective system. If you seem white, if you look white, and people don't know any differently, then I guess you're white. Okay, so the question I get asked by students a lot is, did they love each other? Now, I understand why this question comes up. We want them to have been in love because that makes this story less horrible. So let's see. Did they love each other? My answer to this question is we don't know and it doesn't matter. Seriously, it doesn't matter. Because no matter what their feelings might have been throughout their decades-long relationship, it was never consensual because she was enslaved by him. He was one of the nation's wealthiest and most influential political minds. He was 30 years older than she was, and he literally owned her. If she had any positive feelings toward him, then I guess I'm happy for her, but it's still Stockholm Syndrome. She had no choice in any part of the relationship, and the fact that she was able to negotiate her children's futures is a testament to her own intelligence, strength of character, and savvy than it is to Jefferson's love or generosity. But this relationship gets to the heart of the difficulty of talking about our history of slavery. Because as much as we can simplify it down to laws and codes and rebellions and notable freed Black people who made it, it's not that simple. Everyone involved in this system was a human being with different experiences and attitudes. And every experience is in some way unique. For every Sally Hemings, there were millions of women who couldn't guarantee their child's future. And what does that mean for the legacy of Thomas Jefferson? Is he canceled? No, because he's already dead. And we can understand the importance of his impact on our nation's history, the Declaration of Independence for one, and his entire presidency, which we'll talk about soon. And we can also acknowledge that he was a racist hypocrite. Both things can be true at the same time. Nuance and complexity, my old friend. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe, and go join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.